So how do you feel about that quote? Or even watching that video? How does it make you feel? I'm not asking you what you think about it, what you process in your noggin. I'm talking about what you process in your heart. Does it tap into something, some latent desire, some yet to be explored longing? You just do it one step at a time. You have an obligation to change the world. What's that do to you? Or how about this one? Here's a very, very popular quote by Mother Teresa. I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the waters to create many ripples. What's that do to you? How about this one? A small group of thoughtful people could change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Finally, how about this one? The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Right? Amen. If you are the least bit alive this morning, the least bit paying attention, then I'm guessing that one or more of those quotes awakened at least a teeny amount of something in you. Maybe a little spark, maybe a little nudging, maybe a tiny bit of anticipation. Because if the thought of you being one of those who can actually change the world raised your blood pressure a bit, maybe awakened some possibilities, maybe even revealed a quest, or you felt something about changing the world, well, the reason why you felt that spark is because that's what the good life feels like. The good life is a lot of things, but it certainly is a life of impact. When you engage in an act, some lifestyle, some choice in which good comes to another, like John Williamson has, in which a wrong is righted, in which a need is met by your hand, you say to yourself, because I've heard you say this, people who serve in the care center or serve with our partner ministries, they'll say, it really feels good. I really enjoy it. And the reason why people say that is because you were created to do that. You were created to be one of the crazy ones. You were created to be crazy. Why? Because you are God's masterpiece. You are. How many times do I have to tell you this before you actually believe it? You're created to be God's masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for you to do. When did he prepare this? Before you were even born, he had something in mind. He saw before you were born, he said, okay, well, that one's going to be a crazy one. Okay, no, wait, that one's going to be, wait a minute, they're all going to be crazy ones. Every single one of them, because that's how I designed them. That's how I designed each one of you. So when you do something wonderful and thoughtful, something healing and giving, when you do something right for another person, listen, you are stepping into your God-given destiny. And man, that's the good life. The good life is one of great impact. So if you are the least bit intrigued by that, stay with me. I'm about to give you another taste of the good life of changing the world. But before I do, let's review the series so far. For 3 weeks, we've been giving you a tasting menu. We're going to give you 9 courses. 9 courses in this tasting menu. This is your 4th course. Small bites of the ingredients of the good life, the full life, the abundant life, the life of flourishing, which is exactly what Jesus wishes for you, and he fought so hard for you to experience. You experiencing the good life is the very mission of the Son of God. He said, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full, to the flourishing, the good life. This is why I came. So, 3 weeks ago, we launched it. The first course in our tasting menu of the good life was that of freedom. Freedom, and specifically, freedom from the power and the penalty and the guilt of sin, which is what we all crave. We all want to be free from guilt. But what we learned is if you want to experience freedom, there is something you have to practice. Now, you've probably picked this up so far in this series, but of these 9 slices or courses in the good life, every single one of them is accompanied by a practice. You don't just bump into these things. You don't just bumble into these things. You must practice. And if you want to experience a good life of freedom, you have to practice surrender to Jesus Christ. The second week in the series, Barry helped us understand that if you want to experience fruitfulness, which is another slice of the good life, like a tree in the spring bursting into leaf and fruit, alive with productivity. If you want to have possibilities and productivity in your life, if you want to experience fruitfulness, well, the practice that you've got to engage in is communion with God. Last week, we unveiled the third course of the good life, and that was having a good name or a good reputation. It is a good life when you are well respected and admired. I mean, am I right? Amen. Don't you want to be well respected? You want to be admired by people. That's a slice of the good life. But of course, it doesn't just happen. You don't just suddenly walk into the world and say, ooh, I respect her. I respect it. No, that doesn't just happen. There is a practice you must engage in if you want a good name. And that's the practice of moral integrity. You're not going to have a good reputation. You're not going to have a good name unless you practice moral integrity. That's what we discovered last week. Now, before we move on, I've got to revisit last week because I said something last week I need to revisit. All right? Some of you are smiling because you know what I said. And you can imagine the conversation I had. Remember what I said last week about Game of Thrones? It's really interesting what's happened since then. But I said, if I asked the question, if you watch Game of Thrones, what's wrong with you? All right, remember when I asked that? Well, I want to tell you that asking that question that way was in very bad form. That was shaming. And I had no business communicating something that I believed in by using shaming. So, friends, I'm going to ask you to forgive me. Okay? I'm sorry for saying that, all right? But don't watch it. Are you ready? Should have said it that way last week, and then I wouldn't have. Funny side note. So I've said this now 3 services. Now I'm starting to get emails and conversations with people saying, you should have never apologized for that. Interesting side note. This is not my sermon. I'm making a mistake here by going offline here for a second. Interesting that the comments for feeling shamed and those who are saying you should have never said it are divided right down generational lines. Younger generation felt shamed. Older generation is like, let them have it. Pay attention to this. If we're concerned about losing the younger generation, we need to speak truth, but we need to do it in a way that is heard, right? And responded to appropriately. So there we go. That's a whole other sermon. Here we go. Let's move on. You ready for the fourth course? The fourth ingredient of the good life is impact. I've been trying to say that. The good life is one of great impact. But like the others, it doesn't just happen to you. You don't just walk out in the world and say, here I am, world. I'm a world changer. Look at me. I'm one of the crazy ones. No. There is a practice you must engage in if you're going to cause ripples in the pond of the world. And that practice is justice. Justice. The good life is one of great impact, but the path to impact is through the practice of justice. Well, what do I mean by justice? Well, let me explain it to you, but let's have the Word of God explain it to you. Isaiah chapter 58, page 6. That's page 527 in the Bible's under the seat in front of you. Everybody get a Bible on your lap. Either open up our app on your mobile device or get a Bible on your lap, because how in the world are you going to know if I'm not making this up? I might be making this up. I might well be. So you better double check. All right. Here's the context of the book of Isaiah real quick. Isaiah was a prophet. He was the mouthpiece of God to the nation of Israel. This is a compilation of his writings and probably some other prophets. There may be like 3 prophets who are recorded in the book of Isaiah. 2 of them wrote kind of under Isaiah's name. So the book of Isaiah is broken into 3 parts. Part 1 is actually by Isaiah himself, his writings, his prophecies, and it was spoken to Israel at a time before they were taken over by Assyria and Babylon. There was a time where Assyria and Babylon rushed into Israel and took everybody captive, took them back to Babylon, and they lived as refugees. But this was before that happened. The second part of Isaiah is written by a prophet who spoke to them while they were refugees, while they're in a foreign land, okay? The third part of Isaiah, which is what this is from, was written by a prophet who was speaking to the people after they had returned. Because after they had been refugees for a number of years, after they had been in captivity, they were sent back to Israel. They were allowed to go back. But my word, what they found when they went back, everything was a hot mess. Things were busted up. The Jerusalem, the capital, was all falling apart. There were no walls. They were unprotected. And so they were desperate to try to get everything put back together, and they were desperate for God to intervene. And so somebody came up with a brilliant idea. We will get God's attention if he knows we're serious about this, so everybody's going to participate in a fast. Everybody's not going to eat for a while. That'll get God's attention, because then when we're skinny and we're hungry and we call out to God, he will say, "Oh, you dear souls, then I will hear you from heaven." Well, that didn't work. Here's what God said. Look at the screen from Isaiah 58:4. "You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high." Wah, wah. You mean I didn't eat for like weeks and God still never responded? Right? He said, no, because you got it wrong. This is not the kind, if you want to get my attention, let me describe a different kind of fasting. And that's where we pick up the story, Isaiah 58:6, follow along. "Is not this is the prophets using the words of God, is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? Here's what I want you to do. Loose the chains of injustice, untie the cords of the yoke, set the oppressed free, and break every yoke." That's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to do. "Is it not to share your food with the hungry and provide the poor wanderer," wanderer there means homeless, "with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear, and your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then and only then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, 'Here am I.' That is, if you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and the malicious talk, and if you spend yourself on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and then your night will become like the noonday, and the Lord will guide you always. I'll satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land, and I'll strengthen your frame. You'll be like a well-watered garden, friends, like a spring whose water never fails. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins. You will raise up the age-old foundations, and you all will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings." You see, the good life is one of great impact. You will change the world, but the path to changing the world is through the practice of justice. Now, I want to explain to you what justice is, or the essence of justice. But before I describe that from this passage, I want you to see, and it's in very vivid terms, I want you to see just how good a life that you can experience if you practice justice. Like verse 8. Look at verse 8. "If you practice justice, your light will break forth like the dawn, your healing will quickly appear, your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard." Now, all through this, there's a lot of poetry, and this is really hard to interpret poetry. But let me just take a brief stab at this. He said, if you practice justice, your light will break forth like the dawn. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the prophet had in mind, but I'll tell you what it feels like to me. It feels like a new day. Your light will break forth like the dawn. Maybe that's what it means, but it sure is a good thing. Your healing will quickly appear, he says in verse 8. If you practice justice, your healing will quickly appear. Makes me scratch my head. Is that hyperbole? Could he actually mean it? If you practice justice, you'll be made well. Something to consider. Your righteousness will go before you. What does that mean? I'm not sure, but it might mean that this whole business of your reputation, it'll go before you, will protect you, right? Your integrity will start to protect you. And then I love this last phrase, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Or as Chris tells me, he was in the military, he says, God says, I'll have your six. I'll have your back. Now, listen to me when I say this. This is really important. If you practice justice, you will not have to ask for God's protection. If you practice justice, He promises He will give it to you without you even asking. Does that make sense? If that doesn't get through our thick skulls, I don't know what will. It's pretty extraordinary. Let's go on to verse 9. There's more. You talk about a good life. You'll call and the Lord will answer. You'll cry for help and He'll say, here am I. This is what we all want. I want to be able to know that when I say, God, I need you, God says, here am I. What do you need? What God says here is you practice justice and that's how we're going to roll. I'll be there for you. Verse 10, if you spend yourself in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, here's this again. Your light will rise in the darkness and the night will become like the noonday. I mean, a reference to a new day. There will be clarity. The long night of your life will be over. Verse 11, the Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You'll be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. I don't even need to interpret this. I mean, this poetry speaks for itself. It's a sweet imagery of the good life. I mean, all of this describes the good life. And then the last promise is one I just love, and I'm not sure, it just hits me in a good place. If you're one of the crazy ones, if you're one of the ripple makers, if you're one of the people that practice justice, you're going to get a new name. Here it is, verse 12. The people will rebuild the ancient ruins, will raise up the age-old foundations, and here's what I'm going to call you. You're all repairers of broken walls and restorers of streets with dwellings. I'm not even sure to this day why that gets me at the visceral place. But to be named by God, you are the one that is rebuilding my community. You're rebuilding my community. You're restoring the people around you. Your sphere of influence is going to change because of you. Man, that gets me. That gets me to the core of who I am. The good life is one of great impact. And the path to impact is through this practice of justice. All right, here's what I promised. I said I would describe what the practice of justice looks like. So let me go there. We'll start at verse 6. Here's what justice is. Now, I'm not going to read it. I want you to see 4 words that just jump right out of the page and about this. Now, follow along. The word chain, cords, yoke, and oppression. Now, a little tip on Bible study. If you're reading the Bible and you see repetitive ideas, pay attention to that because God's trying to get your attention about something. All of those words imply similar things. Chains and cords and oppression and what's the other? Yoke. Now, I want you to notice while we're looking at those, there are 4 words that relate to those. They are loose, untie, set free, and break. So you have all these words that describe this, or this, or oppression. And then these words that are loosing and untying and setting free and breaking. Those are the words of justice. The words of strangulation are the words of injustice. It's a graphic picture of injustice, crushing, gagging, stifling oppression. So we get a really graphic picture of injustice. And there's a reason why there's a graphic picture. And I'll get to this in a minute, but it's because the prophet is trying to stir us up, not in our heads, but in our hearts. So let me give you some illustrations. Injustice, for instance, is a slavery of sorts in which a person, a family, or a community is under the control of forces they cannot fight. Illustration. Injustice is a young girl lured into sex slavery. Injustice is an immigrant family stuck in a cycle of generational poverty. Injustice is a 3-month-old fetus facing its elimination through abortion. Injustice is a young man facing again hate-inflamed racism that perpetuates systemic discrimination. These are all aspects of injustice. Now, I think the reason why we have verse 6, and listen to me when I say this, if you're determined to practice justice, you say, I'll be a crazy one. I'll be a ripple maker. It's not going to happen till injustice grips your soul and it bothers you to the core of who you are. the idea of a gagging, oppressive, chained person. You've got to get that in your brain. I'll tell you this right now. There is no impact without agony. There's no impact without agony. You can't waltz in and say, hey, I'm going to provide some food here. This fun. Isn't this great? And I'm going to... No. You have to approach justice with a broken-hearted agony. There is no agony without... there is no impact without agony. It's just not going to happen. So let's get specific. You know this. You don't need verse 7 to tell you this, but let's look at it. What specifically is justice? It is sharing your food with the hungry, providing the poor wanderer with shelter. When you see the naked, clothe them. This is justice. Food, shelter, clothing, basic acts of humanity. Doing the right thing for people who have needs. This week, I was stunned in a good way to hear what the Pope Francis, had to say about what he did this past week. It was all over the news. I hope you saw it. Pope Francis decided on his trip to an island where there were a lot of Syrian refugees, mostly Muslim Syrian refugees. He was going to do his part, or a part. He took 12, this is them getting off the plane, 12 Muslim Syrian refugees onto his private plane, flew them to the Vatican, and they're taking care of them there. Now you could say, oh, it sounds like a publicity stunt. Well, really? Well, there are 12 people whose lives are changed. He was doing what he could do within his capacity to care for a few people. But what stunned both Penny and me, both of us we're watching this unfold on television, and what the Pope said next, we both had a visceral reaction. He said this is exactly what a moral leader should do. That hit me. Now, you may not agree with this theology. I'm not sure I agree with all the Pope's theology, but I'll tell you this. I admire the man for taking a step that says this is what I'm going to expand what he said, though. This is what a moral person will do, to care for somebody in need. But justice is not just practical stuff. There's one more thing I want to point out to you. Justice is deeper than just giving food and clothing. There's something more soulish about practicing justice, and I want to show you verse 9. Look at verse 9. I want you to read it with your own eyes. Because the prophet describes justice as doing away with the pointing finger and malicious talk. In other words, justice is changing our posture and our rhetoric towards other people. Now, this phrase, pointing finger, is awkwardly literally translated, speaking of the finger. Injustice is accusatory. Injustice is defaming. Injustice is prejudicial. Injustice is categorical. You force people into categories, say this is who you are. Injustice is malicious. And I am sad to say that I believe this is exactly what America has devolved into. We are the land of the pointing finger and malicious lips. What some of you are saying on Facebook is embarrassing to me. What some of you are saying on Twitter is embarrassing to me when I realize that we're both followers of Jesus Christ. It embarrasses me how malicious you can be and how malicious Christians can be. If we are going to practice justice, we've got to do away with the pointing finger and the malicious lips. That's the only way, at the soulish level, we're going to have to be able to undo the damage we're creating. Justice is about open palms, not fists and fingers. It's about open arms. And when you practice justice, listen, when you practice justice, part of your role as a crazy one is to set about to change the tone of the dialogue from malice to love. That's the sign of a follower of Jesus practicing justice. The good life is one of great impact, and the path to impact is through the practice of justice. All right, let's wrap this up. I'm about to get insanely practical. Tell the person beside you he's about to get insanely practical. Tell them right now. Insanely practical. All right, here we go. 5 insanely practical ideas. All right, first, First insanely practical idea is you need to start paying attention to injustice. That means first and foremost, first thing you should do is probably not turn to the sports section. Maybe from time to time you ought to dial in some news rather than sports talk radio. Maybe I'm talking to guys mostly, right? I get that, because that's what you do. I know that's what you do. All of us need to pay attention to injustice. Find somewhere that communicates the truth of what's happening in this world and pay attention to it. Get your ears and eyes so that you can start seeing it. Again, we're not going to practice justice until the heart gets broken. There is no impact without agony. Number two, that's number one. Number two, insanely practical thing, is to decide you're going to be the one to change the dialogue in your sphere of influence from malice to love. You are the love speaker, not the malice giver. And you're going to help people. And you know what? You might need to be a little prophetic about it, my friends. Stepping into the lives of people around you, say, you know what? That's wrong what you just said. That's just wrong. I'm sorry, I love you, but you can't. That's malicious. Don't talk like that. Be the one to change the dialogue. Number three, change the way you possess things. Okay, listen. If you're going to practice justice, you've got to, starting today, decide that your time is God's time, not your time. Your time is God's time. And number two, your money is God's money. You don't own a thing. And your time is not your own. If you don't embrace that, practicing justice will be like, well, how little can I get away with? No, that's not crazy thinking. That's some sort of incremental thinking that will get you nowhere. Your time is no longer your time, it's God's time. Your money is no longer your money, it's God's money. 4, at some point you got to stop thinking about it. You got to roll up your sleeves and do something. There are plenty of things for you to do in justice. I counted, there are 35,282 things to do right here at Grace Church. It's hyperbole, I know that. Maybe I miscounted, added a few more things than were really there, but there are lots and lots of things that you can do right here. Serve anywhere within the walls of Grace Church. Serve in our care center. You'll be able to do justice. Our partners, if find something that works you up. Find something that bothers you. We'll show you a partner that you can get connected with that connects you what you're bothered about with changing the world, right? There are lots of things to do. And fifth and finally, join the way of discipleship. If you want to practice justice, join the way of discipleship. What are you going, wait a minute. Well, first, let me tell you this. We got 9 weeks in this series, and for 9 weeks, we're going to tell you to join the way of discipleship. Because all of these practices, you will practice with someone else, including justice. And if you are walking with someone, follow me as I follow Jesus, for the 2 to 3 years, you will talk about injustice. Here's some examples. Ron Stoller is discipling John Raves. Ron said, let's go to Haiti and let's serve on this team. Let's practice justice together. Jackie is discipling Megan. Jackie said, let's go to New York City Relief and let's serve on the streets with the homeless in New York. Let's do this together. That's what they did. Craig said, hey, Kyle, let's go to Japan together. Craig's passionate about Japan. That's Melody Boyer's husband. Passionate about Japan. Kyle, let's go and do this together. This will happen in the way of discipleship. Go out to the lobby. There's a Way of Discipleship Center out there. You can get more information on Way of Discipleship. And if you're in the Way of Discipleship, you can sign that little blackboard out there and with the word that most describes your experience with the Way of Discipleship. If you don't like the way the world is, change it. You have an obligation to change it. Just do it one step at a time. I'm not telling you to go out and be completely wild-eyed crazy from day one. I don't use baseball analogies very often, so I'm going to close with a baseball analogy just because I can. Don't swing for the fences right away. Just get on base. One step at a time. Start with little acts of justice and watch what God does with it and where He takes you. I guarantee you, you practice justice and it will feel like the good life.